Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on the Reframe to Reform podcast. Our mission is to have the difficult conversations about how we can reframe the way society thinks about those who have been justice involved. We know change is possible, and above all else, people do not lose their innate worth once they have been behind bars. I am your host, Callie, and I am honored to be joined by special guests who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. So join us on this adventure where we speak candidly about the topics that matter most and challenge some of society's most common biases so that we may grow together. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Reframe to Reform podcast. I'm your host, Callie, and with me today I have a wonderful special guest, Donna Hamm. She is Executive Director at Middle Ground Prison Reform, and she has been working in that capacity for over 40 years. She has extensive knowledge of the systems at hand and is going to share some of her insights today that are important in regards to reform on both a federal and state level. Thank you so much for joining us, Donna.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. So tell us a little bit about your experience and firsthand kind of knowledge that has gotten you involved in this arena.
Well, I guess I'm not going to go back through details of 40 years, but in 1981, which is obviously older than many of the viewers probably are, I was appointed in Coconino County in Arizona, which is near Flagstaff, as a lower court judge, a justice of the peace by the County Board of Supervisors. And in that capacity, I obviously began training and became interested in the criminal justice system as it pertained to my duties with misdemeanor offenses in the justice courts. But I linked up with some professors at Northern Arizona University who at that time were engaged in a very unique program, which was that they were actually teaching a bachelor's degree level program at the Arizona State Prison in Florence in applied sociology. And it was unique because it was an evening class program. And not only were there inmates participating, but there were staff members as well. So unique was because staff and inmates were attending classes together. And if you can imagine the exchange of ideas and opinions and perspectives that go on when correctional staff, mostly prison guards, and inmates, many of whom were serving life sentences, were in the same classroom together. So my friend, who was a fellow judge and one of the professors, arranged for a tour of the Arizona State Prison for me and arranged for me to meet with members of that class. We did so, and it was very illuminating. Obviously, it made a tremendous impact on me because, I didn't have much experience with the criminal justice system when I was appointed as a lower court judge. And so I began to see that, I had three brothers, and I began to see that they could just as easily have made a wrong turn and gotten into difficulty themselves based on just some of the stories I had heard about my brothers after they became adults. So, you began to have a different perspective that these were not all bad people, that in fact, some of them were good people who made bad mistakes. And it begins to change your perspective a little on the system and how it works, how money impacts the system when people can afford, more and higher priced legal representation. You begin to look at the public defender system in our country and how well or how badly it is funded compared to the prosecutorial side. And of course, it was just a tremendous learning curve for me. I also met on that very first tour a gentleman who was an outstanding student in the program, in the sociology program. And we began corresponding. I began visiting him. And ultimately, 6.5 years later, I married him. Leap of faith. He was serving a life sentence at the time. And so I then began in earnest learning about the executive clemency process, the appellate process, and just educating myself on those particular issues. So and I know this is kind of a long introduction, but, when I became a visitor to the prisons, my status changed tremendously. When I was a judge visiting the prisons, I was treated very respectfully, very congenially. My ideas were listened to. I got a status that I did not enjoy once I became a visitor. And I realized very quickly that visitors and any person who supports a prisoner is automatically suspect. It's as though they are a criminal themselves. And in fact, I learned from my sociology student husband that there's a name in sociology that they have for that, and it's called reflected stigma. The families and supporters of inmates suffer a reflected stigma just because they are connected to someone in prison. It's the reason why a lot of family members don't tell their employers, or in some cases, don't tell their friends that they have a family member who's incarcerated. So I began to be treated very differently. And I realized that there was no active voice at the Arizona legislature that stood up for the constitutional rights of prisoners. And that's when the idea came into being to start middle ground prison reform, which I did in my living room with a few other people. And the rest is history. We are a nonprofit organization. We are all volunteer. No one receives a salary. We have existed as the only advocacy organization in Arizona that is solely working on prison and sentencing reform for the past 43 years. So we're very proud of the fact that we're still here, because a lot of organizations have come and gone, but we've also learned a lot. We started off with a very idealized idea of what we thought we could do, everything from major reforms to scholarships for inmate children, to reentry assistance with jobs, to clothing, tools, housing. And what we quickly learned was there's a lot of stigma out there for people who are trying to assist the incarcerated. And there's not a lot of money that's dedicated to reentry assistance for people. Now, that has improved somewhat over the years, I will say, because there are formal programs now that do assist, but certainly not at the level that's needed. And we didn't have any of that back in the 80s.
Wow, that's amazing to even think about that transition because it's so significant. But I'm also like in awe that in the 1980s they had the program to allow the bachelors in there. Has that sort of programming continued, or have you seen the ups and downs with it?
Well, we've seen, I think the problem in our country has gotten a lot more attention for a number of reasons. I mean, exponentially, the number of people per 100,000 in Arizona who are incarcerated has increased tremendously. But those numbers are universal across the country and including in the federal prison system. We've also seen major changes in criminal codes, mostly connected with money, unfortunately. For example, after the Oklahoma bombing occurred, President Clinton was responsible, along with the United States Congress, in passing the Anti-Death Penalty and Terrorism Act. And part of that act included offering states millions of dollars in money, but they had to agree to increase their sentencing code to a minimum of requiring that violent offenders would stay in prison a minimum of 85% of the imposed sentence. Well, Arizona, in its wisdom, our legislature wanted that money and adopted that criminal code, but we added a twist to it, and we made the 85% minimum requirement for all crimes, including nonviolent crimes. And so what you saw, and that was passed as of January 1, 1994. So what you saw was parole was eliminated for all crimes as of January 1, 1994. And then the 85% requirement began to build the prison population very rapidly over the next 3 years. And then we saw the proliferation and use of private prisons because they couldn't keep up with the building schedules that were needed to incarcerate all these people. So what we have now is a system where in 2025, Arizona still requires the vast majority of both violent and nonviolent or dangerous and not dangerous prisoners to serve 85% of their imposed prison sentence. Many have to serve flat time sentences. And then the only carve out from that is for people with drug possession offenses who now serve 70% of their imposed sentence. But all the other attempts at sentencing reforms have not been successful. The code, the 85%, it's called Truth in Sentencing. That code substantially stands in place today. And that's why we have extraordinarily long sentences in Arizona and why we have the prison population. Because in Arizona, we also have a requirement that if you go to trial and you are convicted of multiple counts, that the judge is required, unless he puts a reason on the record that is acceptable, he's required to impose sentences that are consecutive, one after the other, after the other. So in Arizona, you'll see people serving sentences for, non-violent crimes, but they've gone to trial and they may have 6 or 7 counts, and those counts may have 5 or 10 year sentences, sometimes even more per count. And then they end up with 50 or 60 years in prison. And that's not that unusual in Arizona.
Yeah, I think there's a huge misconception in society about what type of sentences people are actually facing. So I think you shedding light on that is incredibly important because so many people kind of naturally assume, oh, well, these long sentences, they must be for these extreme violent cases, and it's not the case. And like you're saying, it compounds.
Arizona does have now we have for first degree murder, we have natural life or death. Those are the only sentences that can be imposed. We now have natural life if a person is convicted of trafficking a minor, sex trafficking. We have other life sentences that are imposed. So there are those sentences, and we certainly have them. But it's clear that with stacking and consecutive sentences, we have some sentences that amount to life sentences, but they aren't called that. We also have a category wholly apart from that for sex offenders in Arizona. And that's a category that is very difficult for people to be rational about. There's a lot of hysteria about sex offenses, and you're not going to get anything from me to defend anyone committing a sex offense. They're wrong, they're bad, they should be punishable. But what we have done in Arizona that has resulted in sentences that are 300, 200 years in length is that we have taken every sex offense and kind of put them all in the same basket without a lot of differentiation. And we have taken, for example, child pornography, which is bad. No one's defending it. But for each separate picture that a person may be convicted of or plead guilty to, there's a minimum 10-year flat time sentence. So a person who goes to trial with 20 pictures charged and is convicted is going to end up with a 200-year sentence. And we literally have those sentences in Arizona for people who otherwise, quite frankly, should go to prison for a length of time, but who just as effectively could be managed on probation supervision for the rest of their life in the community, and under probation supervision actually get treatment and also not have access to computers.
Yeah, the limitations and different restrictions that can be implemented. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, sex offenders are definitely the pariah, not only of the prison system. They have to be separated from other inmates because other inmates also categorize sex offenders in particular ways that cause them to be subject to physical harm by the inmate population. But we also have a certain hysteria that bleeds into the community. And it's just unfortunate because, again, some of these people who are convicted of sex offenders are people who maybe in college as freshmen have had a sexual relationship with a high schooler who might be 17. And while that's not what any parent wants to see for their child, I'm not sure that that's an offense that we really need to punish with, dozens of years of incarceration or lifetime probation even. We do it here in Arizona.
So I'd love to understand more of what you think, one, will help decrease the stigma that, like you said, not only those incarcerated face, but what about for the families and people trying to promote the awareness and understanding the issues? How do we reduce stigma around it?
Well, it's difficult because a lot of people rely on television and movies and just media, and all the jokes about Bubba from, nighttime television shows. And so you have a sort of a social image that the families of inmates are all, bikers and people who engage in criminal conduct themselves, who happen not to have gotten caught. So one of the things that we've tried to do is that when we bring people down to the legislature to talk to legislators, quite frankly, we try to select from our membership in Middle Ground. We try to select family members who are professionals in the community, who have education and professional credentials, so that it puts them on a level playing field with legislators. I think also legislators themselves have had to deal with the fact that many of their constituents, and quite frankly, even some of their own families, have become entangled in the criminal justice system. So they have a more realistic awareness of just how wide this net spreads. And it isn't just certain families of certain neighborhoods and certain socioeconomic groups. And so that has helped a bit. And then finally, we've tried to educate decision makers about the need for reforms, even for people that they stereotypically consider to be prone to criminal behavior, because those are the folks who need the most direction, the most help, the most reentry services. Those are the children who grow up in circumstances where they're not getting the opportunities that some of the rest of us have. And they end up in the prison, in the school to prison pipeline that is talked about. And so it's a complex issue, and it isn't resolvable with just one answer. There have to be several approaches. But it still is a problem because, even today, there are a lot of people who in certain professions will not admit to their employers or even close friends that they have a family member who's incarcerated because of the stigma. There is stigma associated. And it makes it difficult because if you can't talk about problems with close friends or associates, you can't get the support that you often need.
Absolutely, and there's that carried shame around it versus focus on how do we help, right?
Reflected stigma.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
In your experience, because I know you kind of talked about the idealism that you carried early on and the shifts that happen, what do you see as some realistic reform that can occur in the next 10 years? What do you see in your experience?
Well, the ideal thing, if I were the king or queen for a couple of days, the ideal thing, of course, would be prevention. So we have to have some very effective early interventions. And I think our schools are an ideal place for teachers to be trained and aware of kids who are, abused, who are having problems at home, who are being neglected, who have parents who may be engaged in activities that are affecting their children. I wish we could have parenting classes in the nurseries at the hospital, but that probably isn't realistic because there's all kinds of moral questions that people would try to impose. And of course, whenever those kinds of ideas are offered, there's always or usually some sort of a religious connotation that goes with it, which can't be formally supported by government funding. So, but we need parents who are effective, who know how to raise self-actualizing children. And so that's the core. Um, and so prevention is, and it has to start really, in my opinion, before even teen years. We seem to focus on juveniles when we think about prevention programs. But in my mind, the really challenging prisoners who have a lot of personal deficiencies and problems which render them very unlikely to be rehabilitated, those core problems started for them at a very early age. Diapers. So we have to start earlier than juveniles even. So prevention would be ideal. But once you get into the criminal justice system, I've heard people describe it in various ways, but I describe it as like the fangs of a snake. Once those fangs get into you, it's very hard to lose those scars, and they stay with you. And at the tail end of the snake is the correction system. And people can reach that pretty rapidly, unfortunately, once the fangs are in. And we have an utterly failing tail of the snake. The correction system has so many facets because it is a total institution. It controls literally everything from food, housing, clothing, visitation, medical care, mail, access to legal courts, telephones, the programs, education. It controls every aspect of a prisoner's life. And it's a small city into itself with a government and politics that operate it. And so we have to clean up the politics and the operation of those prisons. And I'm not going to indict every single person who works for a prison. There are good people who go there with good intentions, but there are enough who are corrupt, who are there for the wrong reasons, and who spoil the word corrections, that it makes the system ineffective and harmful in many cases, so that people actually come out of prison worse. Prison for a young man is known to be a gladiator school. And you go in and you harden your soul in order to survive. And, if you think about it, that's not really a good goal for us to be having. But in order to survive in prison, many young men have to protect themselves. They have to become something that they were not even before they went to prison. And they have to adapt attitudes and beliefs that are not consistent with the core values that we would like to have them return to the community holding. And that is just, if you sat down and wrote about corrections, it would be a blueprint for failure. That's what it is. And while they can always talk about success stories, my own husband is a success story. But, we talk about that, and he was a success in spite of the system, not because of it. And unfortunately, not everyone who goes to prison has the ability to overcome all of the negatives in order to make something positive of the experience. And those are the ones we really need to target, because it's not really fair to send someone to prison and then force them to become more problematic internally in order to survive. And that happens a lot.
And I think you're touching on a key component of survival, right? So there's that other ignorant bliss that I think a lot of times people hold on to into society of, well, people just come out worse because they make choices. A lot of times it's people are trying to get through the day, right? Or trying to get through the 10-year plus sentence. And like you said, when it's a system that's wrapped around them and has control over every facet, the little bit of control people find is through, well, can I shapeshift to get through this? And then undoing that, right? So I work on that external side of seeing people trying to undo that learned behavior over that extensive course of time. It's a lot of work for people to engage in. And if services aren't there, supports aren't there to assist with that, that's a very heavy burden to come out of a system with, when that wasn't put on your shoulders when you first walked in. So absolutely.
Right. And one of the things the prison really needs to do is to have a classification system that separates people who want to change and are willing to work on it, because it's not a linear process. You go up and down, especially someone with addictions, someone with a mindset that is completely antisocial and needs to change. It's a process, and they need to have a classification system which allows people to go back and forth. I mean, you may not enter prison with a mindset that you are willing to do the work that needs to change. An awful lot of people end up early on in their prison sentence with a very bad attitude. They're angry to be there. They feel like they didn't get fair treatment in the justice system. They hate their lawyer. They think their lawyer did a terrible job. The prosecutor's mean. The judge is angry. They're blaming everyone else. And it takes a moment before they can sit and really hit rock bottom and look in a mirror, if you don't mind all the platitudes here and metaphors, and just decide, okay, what am I responsible for? What can I do to change this picture? And once they do that, though, once they reach that, they need to be in a situation in a prison where they're surrounded by other people who are similarly motivated. And the prison system really doesn't separate people that way. They have a system that is really smoke and mirrors, and it doesn't reward things that should be rewarded. And it's a one size fits all, very much. And, with a gargantuan system that we have, the Arizona state prison population, including private prisons, totals anywhere between, it'll fluctuate, but between 35 to 42,000 people at given times. Well, obviously you can't just take all of those people all at once, but you can have pilot programs that begin to have success and build on that and demonstrate the success of that and begin to fashion a classification system that works on those premises, that people are there who want to change, who are willing to do it, and need the opportunity to do that so they can support each other. We don't have that in Arizona prison. We also, of course, we cannot have this conversation without talking about the staff shortages. They're critical. They are causing all types of problems that the department will not even own up to. And they impact almost every operational function that the prison has. And of course, beginning with security and just rule enforcement, because if you don't have those two things in prison, you can't really have any of the other things going on. You have to go first with security, safety for staff and prison and prisoners. And then you have to have rule enforcement, because that engenders respect for rules. And you've got 100% of your prison population are there for breaking rules. So I think that should be a premise that they would start with. And they don't. They wink at a lot of rules that they write, and either don't have the rule or enforce it. That's what we think should be going on and is not.
Gotcha. So, as far as the staff shortages, some of those barriers, what would, in your eyes, change that or promote a culture where people would be willing to work in corrections, right? When we see the flaws.
Yeah, one of the things we've proposed is that college students who are studying not just in criminal justice, but in sociology, in social work, in the social sciences, that they be given college tuition credits for agreeing to work in a prison for a minimum after graduation of, let's say, 3 years or 5 years, and that they be given tuition credits. That seems to me to be an opportunity to build a core of people who are not just engaged in police work enforcement, but who also have the abilities and skills and educational credentials to be change agents and to assist in that in ways that they can't. So that's one idea that's been floated, and I think it has value. It needs tweaking, and but at least is something that has potential, and it seems to have worked in other fields. But the department has to recognize that it isn't just about salaries. You know, they love to go to the legislature and talk about their recruitment and retention, and they base it all on the ability to have raises given to the line staff and their office employees as well. But they certainly talk about pay for guards that needs to be increased. And while everybody loves to make more money, I'm certainly not denying that. That isn't their only problem with staff retention and recruitment that we've heard about. You know, people come to us after they've left the Department of Corrections in disgust. And it generally isn't about the money. It's often about the way that they were valued or treated, about how their ideas are not valued or treated, where they are, it's a very militaristic system, paramilitaristic system. And so they are not given an opportunity for input if they are at the lower levels. They have they don't have the opportunity that they want for developing policies and programs. So there are a lot of ways that the department really needs to shine a light on their own practices that have nothing to do with paychecks.
Yeah, that's a good point of like if people are valued, they push to stay somewhere that they feel heard, right? And if people are coming
Yeah,
in
we
trying
hear a lot of staff who will say, you know what? It's above my pay grade. I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to jump in the middle of a knife fight between inmates to stop them because I'm not going to get hurt. They will, the other thing that is very important to talk about, and again, this doesn't get talked about very much at the legislature, and that's important because those are the decision makers. There's some inmates are motivated to play games and do engage in nefarious activities, illegal activities, dangerous activities while they're in prison. But guess what? They often rely upon bribing staff members to bring in drugs, to bring in weapons, to bring in contraband. You will often hear prison officials talk about how visitors bring in drugs, but visitors are often caught bringing in drugs for one particular person. In other words, a small amount of drugs for a boyfriend or a husband or whatever. The large amount of drugs, the drugs that are brought in for sale to other inmates that are paid for by gangs who are organized on prison yards and who have thousands of dollars to distribute and negotiate. Those drugs are brought in by staff members or by contracted workers. Those are problematic because they involve large amounts of contraband that are then distributed on the yards. And the department won't admit what a problem that is. It's embarrassing. They don't want you to believe that they have corrupt staff, but they do. And they need to acknowledge that because it is part of the problem. And they need to be screening very carefully, and they need to prosecute when someone is caught so that there will be a known consequence for people who are doing that. They can't just be fired. That's not a sufficient consequence. They have to be prosecuted.
Yeah. Well, and it's that like double-edged sword of you have people you are incarcerating for these same crimes, but then you're brushing these crimes under the rug, and people are dying.
Exactly.
Right? People are
And
dying.
of course, that creates, there's an animosity, there's an irony that is not missed by the prisoner population when they see that going on. And it just increases the we versus them mentality that already exists in a prison milieu where, it's not a collaborative environment. Most people don't go into prison with a feeling or an understanding that I'm going to work cooperatively with the Department of Corrections to make sure that I never repeat any criminal behavior again, and they're going to help me. That is not the general attitude that a prisoner will express. Instead, it's, the guards are against me. They're only here to punish me and make my time harder and worse and less pleasant than it already is. and I'm going to see how I can get around them and make fools of them, because that's what will make me feel better and more powerful. So it's already set up in many ways to fail, and that is perpetuated very, very strongly in most circumstances in prison.
I'd be curious to know if what you've observed working in kind of the system and capacity, right? So I've seen people acting out in anger, but really I feel it's been fear, right? So what you were just describing is that basis of like, I'm going to get them before they get me. I'm going to one up this person so that I see value in myself. Has that been a similar experience for you where we see all these behaviors both on the correction side, staff side, as well as the population being served of like everyone seems to be acting out of fear at a deep core level and it's being placated by these other emotions and presentations, whether it's violence, anger, like ego, those kind of variables. I'm just curious, what does your experience look like with that?
Well, I'll make an observation. This is a universal problem, and certainly we have it in the Arizona prison system. And statistics back this up on every study that's ever been done. Minorities are treated much more harshly in the justice system than Caucasian and ethnic groups as well. And so what you see is a lot of ethnic groups who in prison who already understand on a socioeconomic level, on a racial level, that they've been treated more harshly than maybe the white guy in the bed next to them for the same type of crime. And when you go into prison, you encounter all the worst divisions that we think have been resolved, or at least on the surface have been resolved, but it's a different world in prison. There are still tremendous racial and ethnic divides in prison. And for example, if you're a Black inmate, if you're a Native American inmate, Mexican, or Caucasian, let's just use those as four major groups, you're expected to only eat in the chow hall with people of your own race. You're expected to only house with people of your own race. You're expected to, if there's ever a work stoppage or any kind of a demonstration on the prison yard to protest something, you have to participate with your own race or ethnic group. And there are very serious consequences if you refuse to do that. Now, the department a few years ago had a lawsuit that was ruled against them, and it ended up with them implementing what was called the IHP, the Integrated Housing Program. And what they did was they offered voluntarily to inmates to mix races and ethnic groups to live together. And they offered privileges that were not offered to others as an incentive. But the bottom line was the court ruling said that over a span of, I believe it ultimately got extended to about 8 years, they were required to implement so that ultimately the entire Department of Corrections was integrated, and anybody who absolutely refused to participate voluntarily or by order would be placed in higher custody level with very few privileges, and that would sort of be the answer to people who refuse to do it. Well, what happened was some inmates did agree because they had no problem when they were living in the community mixing with other races or ethnic groups, and they didn't have those kind of prejudices. But then you become a target in prison for the ones who still have those prejudices. So if you got in trouble on an integrated housing program yard and you were put back in detention or you were put back in another yard for whatever reason that wasn't part of the IHP program, now you're facing inmates who have problems with you because they know you came from an integrated housing program yard and there were repercussions for that. So they didn't implement it very well. They didn't honor their privileges. There were many inmates who felt like they had signed up for the program and then didn't get the privileges. They didn't read the fine print, which said they may provide privileges, not that they shall provide privileges. And so, honestly, it's been a mess. And a lot of people are scratching their heads because it sounds like a great idea. And a lot of people in the community think, what the heck? This should be going on anyway. And a lot of people will say, well, why don't they just force them to integrate? And they don't understand that prison does not operate by the same rules. It's a different country in many respects. There's a different language in prison. There are unwritten rules that if you don't follow them, you're in danger. Your life is in danger. Just for example, if you steal something from another inmate, even if you borrow something, you can owe a debt that you can never repay. If you snitch on someone and talk to the administration about the behavior of someone that's breaking a rule and someone else finds out about it, it doesn't even have to be the person you snitched on. It can just be another inmate. You can get in trouble for that. If you purchase drugs from someone and don't pay your debt, you can be in trouble for that. And I don't mean just owing the money. I mean in peril for your life if it's serious enough, or if you have insulted or snitched or testified against a validated gang member. It's a whole different society, and you have to learn and adjust very quickly. And people on the outside don't understand that.
Absolutely. What is it that you think, as a takeaway, would be most important for people to start to grasp or comprehend about the people we're trying to serve and promote awareness for? What do you want society to know?
Well, first of all, I think we overuse prison. I think there are a lot of crimes that if you did nothing to reduce crime, but just look at the ones that are going to prison, I think we overuse not just prison itself, that a lot of people could be very effectively and appropriately supervised in the community. We now have electronic monitoring, we have probation. And secondly, the length of time that people are going to prison is it's overkill, if you'll pardon the expression. It is overkill. And we really need to look at the ancillary impact of what that does to families, to children of the incarcerated, just all of the societal impact. Those are the things. And then on the flip side of that, we haven't talked about this, but over the years, I've become very involved with families of victims, and they need to have a voice. They need to have their voice heard. There are clearly some crimes that are so egregious and where the offender is not willing or able to take responsibility. And those folks have a need to have their voice heard as well. And so there needs to be, an ability to make sure that those victim rights are enforced. I'd love to see a lot more use in the Arizona prison system of victim offender meetings where people who are victims come in to speak en masse to prisoners just about their experience of being a victim and how it felt and how it impacted them. And then they have one-on-one situations where a victim may wish to meet specifically with the offender who committed the offense against them or their family. And those are often important too, always at the initiation and cooperation of the victim, of course. But the department would do well to have a lot more victim impact programming going on so that people understand it's not just a burglary. You violated someone's sanctity of their home, their privacy, their dignity, their sense of safety by entering their home, even if they weren't there. And the, an ability to help them have some empathy for the impact of what they did. And it isn't just about them and what happened to them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's putting that face to the name, right? And seeing that impact.
Absolutely. Putting a face to a case number and the impact. Yeah. Because, in some cases, these victims have generations of harm that are passed down to their children. And that needs, somebody even who's working on recovery and restoration and rehabilitation from a serious crime needs to understand the full impact that they have had on someone that didn't know them, probably, or that didn't deserve to have the kind of impact that they've had on that family.
Yeah, and you're describing with healing, right, and restoration, that's culpability and owning what we've done to make amends and kind of move forward through that. And it's a healing process on both ends. So, yeah.
Right. There is there's an entire set of literature and programs that talk about restorative justice. And that's something that we really could explore. It seems pie in the sky, but we really could learn a lot from other countries, Norway in particular, about the way that they approach incarceration. Because while everybody loves to make fun about how what a luxurious and soft on crime approach they take, they also produce results. And that's what we're lacking. We have a very shameful recidivism rate, and the bottom line is, if you don't care about anything else, it's a waste of money. The Department of Corrections in Arizona is I believe it's the third or fourth largest bureaucracy funded in state government. The operating budget is over $1 billion a year, well over that. And so we're investing a lot of our tax dollars in a system that doesn't work very well. And that is something we all need to be concerned about. I don't want to waste my tax dollars on something that is actually creating a larger problem rather than solving anything. And that's exactly what the department is doing right now.
Yeah. So there's a lot of opportunities for change, right?
Yeah, it's going to take some vision. It's going to take commitment from the very top, from at least on the state level, from the governor, because she appoints the director. It's going to, at the federal level, it's going to take the United States Congress to intervene. We haven't talked about the federal system. They recently passed an oversight bill that, if it were ever implemented, would at least allow some opportunity to go in and look at some of the very serious and similar problems that the federal system has. But they didn't fund it. So it's just sitting there. It's on a nice, pretty piece of paper with the president's signature on it, and it has absolutely zero effect. And so we have to get serious. It has to become a priority. People have to be talking about it at every level, and there has to be a sustained commitment, because this problem didn't grow to what it is overnight, and it's certainly not going to be fixed overnight.
Absolutely. We're talking about generational changes that'll take time, right?
Yeah, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. I get that, but I feel an obligation to work on it, because I know it's out there, and you have a sense of responsibility if you know something to do something.
Exactly, and you're helping the viewers know something, right? You're expanding that
Hopefully, yeah,
out.
hopefully, yes.
Is there anything else you would like to share, just kind of with your insights and knowledge, as like a closing piece of anything else you want to bring to the table?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to talk. It's an important topic. Um, just middle ground. We got our name from being middle of the road. We are not people who believe that prison should not exist. We understand that there are some people who are so dangerous, to themselves or to others, or both, that they need to be removed from society. But when you talk about a correctional system, we also understand that the vast majority of people who are in the criminal justice system, with the correct, helpful intervention, caring, someone who demonstrates that they care about their eventual outcome, uh, with that kind of intervention, they can turn their life around. They can become a productive, contributing person. And that's what middle ground means. It means that we take a middle of the road approach, where we're realistic, but we also want some idealism thrown in there too.
Yeah, the best of both worlds, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, Donna. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Absolutely. Appreciate you.